Okay. Ian Siegel of Streamline Learning. What a pleasure to see you today. How are you?
Wes Carroll, it's good to see you. We were just talking about music. I think
Yeah.
I would love to get back
exactly.
into that.
Sure.
And I feel like I've been dominating the topics and dictating this and that. I'd love for you to lead on this one. Yeah. See where we can go.
I'm just happy to be hanging out with you. Yeah, you were talking about how in middle school you were you kind of got off to a music tear, and then other things grabbed your attention, and it sort of just got left behind. Meanwhile, I went on and did a bunch of other music stuff. And it's funny to me because for me, I think a big piece of what did it, like I took saxophone in fourth grade, same as everyone else, right? Or whatever, it was sixth grade. I don't even remember what it was. But I think the big thing for me was I went to a boarding school for high school. It had a really regimented schedule. And there were relatively few, free periods available to do your own thing. But one of the things that was available to you to do when you had those times is they had these practice rooms, these, soundproof-ish rooms with decent pianos in them in the Music and Arts building. And that was just my go-to. Like I would just go into a room with a piano and just kind of beat on it. And the beautiful thing about being, a rank amateur musician is that when you sound like crap, you don't know it and you don't mind. So it's like, whatever, right? But the beautiful thing was, are you familiar with Derek Sivers by chance? Derek Sivers,
Yeah,
the
yes.
founder of CD Baby?
Definitely,
Yes, okay.
yeah.
Big hero of mine for sure. And one of the many wonderful essays he's published is about his encounter with a music teacher whose name is Chemo. I forget his last name. But it's the notion that there isn't a speed limit. The notion that like you can do things at the pace that the class does it, or you can do it at whatever pace is, I don't want to say comfortable. You can do it at whatever pace keeps you on that steep part of the learning curve, where you're growing the fastest. Right. And that's the thing about being locked in a music room for 2 hours with no agenda and just a piano is like if there's some part that you don't like the way it sounds, you got nothing going on in your life but to figure it out and work it out. And so I would do that, and by the end of my time there, it was just like, OK, no one's ever going to mistake me for a concert pianist or anything. But I can hear a thing and I can get it to come out the piano well enough that an actual musician knows what I mean. Right. And it's like, OK, that's a certain level, right? And then I, went away to school, studied computers, all this kind of good stuff. And then I realized, gee whiz, I'm missing music. So I went to music school. I went to Berklee College of Music. And thankfully, it's funny because Berklee is one of these places where it's an undergraduate institution, but probably, 20 or 30% of the people there, maybe even more, are kind of going to music finishing school. They're just going there to meet people and link up with people that can get them gigs. And so most people don't even finish Berklee, right? They show up for a year or two or whatever, and then they're touring, right? Mm-hmm. So I did my year at Berklee, met up with some people, started gigging. And while I was there, I got to know, okay, this is what it's like to actually play, which was a really nice thing for me, right? Like I was like, oh, I can play piano. And I remember I was a voice principal. You have to pick an instrument. You have to pick a course of study. So my instrument was voice, and my course of study was songwriting, with some arranging on the side. And at one point I thought, God, I'm not that good a singer. Maybe I should try piano. And I tried out for the piano department, and like you could see it. You could see the look on the guy's face. It's just like, dude, like don't quit stick with the voice thing. Like however bad it is. I'm like, okay,
different
fine,
level. I mean, people put in time on a piano. Yeah.
Well, of course, I'm thinking, well, I've spent, hours every week for years. And it's like, no, these people have spent multiple hours every day for decades. And it's like, yeah, there's I can't hang with those cats. Mm-hmm. But I wound up, doing some touring and learning from some of the other folks that I was touring with and stuff. And because of my computer music crossover, I came this close to being involved with one of the early music apps. You may recall Guitar Hero.
Oh yeah.
Well, it turns out I know those guys.
Oh, wow.
And I wound up, interviewing for them. I got a job with their company really early on, and to this day, I don't know why, but I turned it down. And I'm like, what was I thinking? And I've looked everywhere for that offer letter just so I can like, put it on the wall just as a, reminder to myself, don't miss an awesome opportunity. But even so, it was great to watch them kind of do their thing. But I bring it up because that's where I started playing drums, is with their game Rock Band. And I think there are a lot of people out there that had that same experience of like, oh, this Rock Band thing. It's kind of a video game, but it turns out, right, that the drumming skills it teaches are actual drumming skills. The singing skills it teaches, at least some of them, are actual singing skills. And a lot of people, I'm not the only drummer I know who got his start playing Rock Band.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Anyway, so I've been doing that now for I don't know how many years, and really having a great time. I have my buddy comes by with his bass guitar once a week, and we've added a keyboardist recently, and we'll have a rotating cast of backup musicians and stuff, and we managed to fit them in this extremely tiny office somehow, and we have a good time for a few hours. So it's fun.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I know, it's great. But sorry, I got off on a tear there. But the thing I was really trying to drive at is the idea of there is no speed limit, right? Sivers thing, and I think he's dead right, is, if you find a thing that you really enjoy and you have some kind of feedback loop to it, then you can get more done in this much time than some people can get done in this much time.
Yeah.
And that's a thing that kind of comes back to the whole tutoring thing and the learning thing. And
well, I think about like the type of tutors I want to recruit to my company, and they often are like musicians or have some kind of hobby where they learned all the way, including athletics also, and a situation where they understand this idea of, there's this broadening of frameworks as you make increasing parts of the learning experience automatic, so that you see further into the sport, into the sight reading, whatever, you're able to kind of, it's not such a big hike up. And there's this experience of this team aspect of it, whether in athletics or on, in a band, jamming together, understanding everyone kind of bringing their best to that team sport. And I think about tutoring as a team sport, and like what that really involves in terms of people bringing their best selves as learners and all that stuff. So I was thinking about that. And I was also thinking about, as you were talking, just like how it seems like a lot of musicians' stories often involve the Suzuki method without, like, whether it was intentional or not, that at some level you're kind of hearing and you're seeing the end game earlier, versus my experience with piano, which was awful, I thought, where it's just like playing these songs I hated, and, working on the basics, kind of the idea of, how Elon Musk says, you shouldn't really like just give someone an instruction manual for a wrench. You should just give them a wrench and just like, and just if they need help figuring out how to use it, then they'll like turn around and be like, well, what do we know about wrenches? At that point. And I feel like it's just such a, there's a lot of similarities for this like authentic learning across these disciplines. What do you think?
I think you're on something really important there, actually, because let me see if I can come up with a way to say this clearly. There's a feedback loop involved in learning. Let's say that you're trying to teach me, I don't know, you're trying to teach me something that that I don't, right? Auto repair, I don't know. I'm just picking a thing. Then what's going to happen is we're going to show up at the broken car, and you're going to say, okay, Wes, here's the stuff you need to be looking at, and here are some diagnostic things you need to be doing, and here are some of the possibilities that you could be doing next, and so on. And then I try a thing, and then you say, oh, that's good, but like, you're holding the wrench wrong, or like, whatever it is, right? But there's this feedback loop of like you're guiding me, I'm doing the thing, and you're using your expertise and experience to help me adjust as I'm doing it. Because if I were going to try and do it alone, I'd have to learn all these things by trial and error. But if it's you doing the car repair through my hands with my brain turned off, it's going to be excruciatingly slow, right? There needs to be this marriage of, I'm the one doing the thing. It's not that the feedback loop goes through you. The feedback loop is entirely in my own head, where it's 1,000 times faster than spoken language. It's just that if you're there also, you can be mirroring my loop and noticing when I'm making like some egregious error and saying, oh, okay, let's pause for a second here. You're about to touch the 2 terminals of the battery. That's going to end badly for all involved. Let me give you a little bit of instruction here, and then you can pick it up from there, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, that's very valuable. You know what I'm saying? So I think there's something in that idea of, like, yes, having an expert on hand is enormously valuable. And yet, I think in a lot of classrooms, the teacher is standing in for the kids' brains in some contexts.
Yeah.
Now, I don't mean to cast aspersions at teachers. Good teachers, I think, can manage to avoid this. But there are some of the ways in which that's kind of baked into certain kinds of classrooms, where even a good teacher would have a lot of trouble avoiding that loop. Far better if each kid is kind of thinking about it, him or herself, running their own feedback loop, and then, right, you find that sweet spot between I'm doing it all by myself quickly but with no expertise. I'm doing it entirely externally through the expert, which means I'm not really learning the way I ought to be. Nope, sweet spot. I'm doing it myself, and I'm getting course corrections that keep me from these huge cul-de-sacs of wasted effort, and instead I just stay on the superhighway towards the goal.
Thank you. I mean, this is something I touch on in my book, School Sucks, Your Child Doesn't. It's just that...
I love that title.
It's just, because one part of it, if we really think about... because if you think about, like, what's the more advanced technology? Human beings or this building, that we've come up with as an institute and the institutional ideas around it. So it's like, I think that, like, just with that framework, we can kind of start to see there are probably some big issues that you're beginning to allude to with the institution itself. And part of it is a socioeconomic thing. It's that
part of it, a huge part of it, for sure.
Well, a huge part of it, because we can't afford to have kids be held back if they're not ready to move on to the next phase. It's like the system is a conveyor belt, which again, I put that in some massive, bunny ears there.
You know the old saw, right? You think education is expensive, try ignorance.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. We are ignoring, again, we talk about how expensive the ignorance is, but we're not actually kind of making the connection to the failure to adequately fund education and learning in a way that is effective rather than efficient, because the efficiency model really quickly reverts back to what you're talking about, which is creating these very specific kind of like ways to have students regurgitate knowledge where there's a significant enough percentage of them who will be able to regurgitate, and therefore we can move this this population along again by age rather than by skill or knowledge, which also creates a lot of challenges around like pacing and organization for classrooms even.
For sure. Let me take a page from your playbook, or at least try. I'm going to try and drop some controversy into this and just kind of see what it does for you, right? And I'm a firm believer in the idea that, the way you get a pearl is you drop some sand into the oyster, right? Like, you can't overdo it, right? But that's what I'm going to try and do, is drop some sand in here. I'm going to make the claim that it comes down to our collective inability to maintain focus on a long-term time horizon. Okay? If we're focused on how well we're going to do on the test in a few weeks, we can all do that. And we can do that because we know what a few weeks is. We trust that we're going to get there in a few weeks. We trust our capacity to learn over the course of a few weeks, right? And it's sort of bite-sized and manageable. But we don't tend to think as systematically about retaining all the things that we learned over the course of the year and burning it into our brains as new skills over the course of the year. That part gets more taken for granted. And again, there are invisible systems in schools that are trying to do the very thing I'm claiming they don't do. And I don't mean to say otherwise, but I'm just saying that, especially as students, but as a culture in general, we're very focused on the short term. That's the source of a lot of different problems. And I think there's a trust issue that comes up, because here's the thing: because I can't think decades in the future, we're not built for it. Like that's not how intuition works, right? We don't do that. I simply can't get out of the mindset, easily that the person that when we're teaching my 9-year-old in her 3rd grade class, we're teaching a 3rd grader. Because that's what I see. That's all the feedback I get. She's a 3rd grader. Why would I argue with that? But it's like, yeah, but we're not teaching her this stuff in order that she'll be a successful 4th grader. We're teaching her this stuff because she's going to be in charge one of these days along with all of her peers.
Right.
Like, the person we're teaching right now is the adult she'll be in 20 years.
Yeah.
But that's not where we're coming from day to day. You know what I mean? It's like and we all know this. It's not like I'm saying anything, controversial in that sense. But doesn't it strike you that if we were really in touch with the fact that we're teaching the people who are going to be running the show in 30 years, and here's the thing. Another thing that we often get caught up in is like, well, if they miss something, we can figure it out later. It's like, well, okay, that is true to a degree for sure. But it's like you get one shot at teaching it the first time. Imagine a world in which you just got it right most of the time. Imagine a world in which you didn't have to wait for the full year to get to whatever 4th grade means. Imagine a world in which you weren't limited to learning the things that are on the syllabus for middle school. I mean, the reason they're on the syllabus for middle school is that that's the maximum stuff that we can fit in a time we know everyone can get through, and we've chosen it to be the stuff that is most important and builds on itself best. Like, a lot of thought has gone into what we're going to teach, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, that's great, but like, in any given classroom, right, 1/3 of the kids, 10% of the kids, whatever, are going to be able to take in a lot more. And that number goes way up if you get a little broader about what they're learning. There's going to be one kid in the class who can go way beyond what everyone else can with respect to history, with respect to music, with respect to emotional learning, with, whatever it is, right? People have strengths, right?
Yeah.
And anyway,
exactly.
I started to preach a few minutes ago, so I'm gonna.
No. I mean, thank you taking over for me. I mean, I can't agree more. And I'm like, but I'm really like thinking about, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about this like really broadly, and thinking about like psychological human conditions that contribute to what you're saying. So again, what Wes is saying...
It's not like there's some bad guys trying to make it go wrong.
No,
we're all doing the best we can, and there's some... Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and institutions, right, because they're big, often, and also, in my opinion, moldy, like literally buildings causing brain issues, combined, can have some challenges for, just actually, like, kind of doing the right thing on the learning front. And what I'm thinking about is just... But this is a problem that's kind of predates school, which I think is just human insecurity. And that has been exacerbated by the modern age a little bit. Because I think part of...
bit.
Yeah.
A little bit, you say.
I mean...
A little bit.
Tell
me more.
Just slightly. Again... But again, if we frame it out, it is an interesting idea that that's the case, because, I mean, it seems as if that... Before modern history, there's a lot more shit to be scared of. Like things like...
Well, that is true. Right. All right, that's fair.
Right? Like, and
yeah, so that's true.
So what it is...
We're not gonna get eeten by an animal.
Right.
That's a thing.
Right. Exactly. But
the number of people who are actually going to die of malnutrition is smaller.
Right.
At the very least, there is enough food to go around, even if it isn't getting distributed in a way that gets the job done. But
all that,
sure.
There's way lower infant mortality rates, so there's way less like really traumatic stuff. Used to be 1 in a quarter, but I think there's just this overabundance of small stressors that accumulate to be this like kind of overwhelming thing in modern society. But just the framing of kind of learning and everything is really around, do you know what everybody else knows? And or like, are you doing what is perceived socially as the right thing? And so that's not a framework where it's like, oh my God, so glad you were born because you're going to bring something important to this world that we're not sure of yet, but we're going to figure this out and pull it out of you. And you're so special. We're so glad you're here. It's more like, let's see if you can, fit into the shoes that we're expecting and kind of fit in and take it a little bit further, but ways but in ways that we're expecting usually, like kind of in like, just this, but a little bit along these lines, a little further, kind of making mom and dad proud. And I think like that part of it creates this situation where learning is like, hey, I need to turn around and get affirmation every 2 weeks. And that we need to give people that as educators, right? Or else it's an, problem with us also. It's like the too quick, turnaround to judge oneself and others before the learning actually takes place. There's a really clear example with tutoring that I find with that parents unfortunately often find themselves doing. So imagine you pay for private school, especially private schools that are basically public schools that you're paying for, which creates just a different population, and it's not really, moving the dial anymore. And then you're like, test prep, I got to pay for that also. We confront that. And a lot of these kids and parents know, even though they don't want to kind of make the connection to standardized testing, is that their child has not been reading outside of school. And even within school, it's the kind of reading that's very superficial. What does the teacher want to hear and all that? And what happens is we can fix that problem. We can really get in there, get a kid, up to reading levels. But it's like, it's an hour amount that is, to me, insignificant compared to the crazy number of hours a child's spending in school, but a little bit beyond what a parent has in their mind that they're thinking that they're going to pay for, and the time investment that the kid has outside of school. So what happens is they're just this far away from a transformative learning experience. But instead they turn around and they're like, let's evaluate. This doesn't seem good enough. We need to move on, because they're used to the school kind of affirmation. If you're secure in who you are and yourself, you don't need to do the turnaround to like, hey, am I okay? Am I good now? Is this all right? You'll know that things will be turning out okay and that you'll grow into things. But I think it's that social stressors that people are constantly facing through social media, through just like the kind of parent to child kind of, I'm worried about things. And then, are things going to be okay? The college admissions process sure is ambiguous these days. I mean, are things that are, I just keep coming down as reasons to be insecure, which then creates this kind of not learning all the way, which is so ironic because that would solve all the problems.
I'm hearing some other things in there too. I think we could agree that that primarily because of technology's influence, and I don't mean in the last few years, I mean in the last, in over centuries, technology has been accelerating, right? Yeah. The rate at which things are moving continues to speed up, and again, we feel that it's happened because of the internet and the iPhone and AI and all this stuff. There was a generation that felt it was because of the printing press, and they were right? It seems super quaint now, but books were a big freaking deal. They changed everything, right?
A very controversial technology for sure.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, as things speed up, what happens? Well, we feel put upon to respond ever more quickly, right? To be more urgent, right? And like Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, right? The more you require snap judgment, the more you're using a part of your brain that's good at snap judgment, but doesn't have the advantage of some of the slow, calm, rational thought processes that work best in concert with it, right? We go faster, we make quicker judgments, we feel more urgency, we feel more stress. And I don't mean to say that's the driving force. I just I'm agreeing with you strongly and saying that there are a lot of different cultural trends, this among them, that contribute to and accelerate this trend that pour kerosene on the fire in some sense, right?
I would go further to say that what you're saying right there around when you're so what we're describing as a neurological process is the thinking fast and slow is, hey, kind of mostly right hemisphere is like, hey, this is the conscious experience, and I can just basically like quickly see that this is what this is. And if something is in line with what I'm expecting, I am not pushing over to my left hemisphere as much, where I'm like cranking and like slowing down and thinking and wait, what is this? And but what I've noticed with students who have had kind of either, and again, I think a little brain health stuff going on, and or just kind of traumas around some kind of learning experience in school where they didn't feel good enough, is the actual process of thinking hard makes them think something must be wrong with me, that I'm not automatically getting this. And that kind of like cranking turns into, you know, some real anxiety and self-doubt. And so it becomes really hard to divorce that for some students, but really important to be like, no, hey, everything's good. You're just thinking right now. This is just a little bit tough. But they start to be like, this should be easy. And then, you know, then they might not even have much of a context for whether it should be easy or not. They're just thinking,
Sure.
Screw me. You know, I'm the worst because I can't immediately know this. And other people who are geniuses or smarter are getting this without getting pushed into an actual thinking slow mode. And, you know, good gosh, that's so terrible. And it's like, hello, everybody has that somewhere, you know, but it's just unfortunate because that's not in the theater of school. There's very specific things that are valued. And
That's right.
And so then we don't start to see certain people's kind of weak spots, which like could be very, like socially oriented, which is really important, or anything. And then two, just the framework of the insecurity, you know, like who's not good enough is basically what's going on in school in a classroom. People looking around, I hope I'm good enough, you know, I hope I don't fail, is just that framework. I think is just really exacerbates the possibility of learning. And I think it's kind of like these biological limits that are already there, you know, in terms of learning, like, I got to go to sleep now kind of thing, or, God, I'd love to pay attention, but I have to pee really bad kind of thing. But now there's these like artificial ones on top of our already biological limits that's exacerbating those limits also, I'm noticing. And I think in other words, it's just like it's a Herculean effort almost to just be a kid these days and try to be like relatively like a good learner, you know, just like who's like okay with making mistakes, for example, just to start with.
That's a big one. Wow, there's so much there. You're getting into the whole business of mindset, right? The idea of the way to learn, you get better at doing something by growing, and growing is what happens. Like, experience is what you get when you don't get what you want, right? Like, growing happens because you do it wrong. Like, that's how one learns at the core. And if you're not willing to be wrong, if you're not willing to not know stuff, you're shutting down your primary mechanism for improvement. It's like, that's not going to end well. The bright students, right? They get a double hit of it because, you know, first of all, they're, you know, inadvertently, I hope, visiting some of that mindset on their peers, right? The kids in their class or whatever, because they're like, well, geez, Jenny gets it all right away. I should get it right away. It's like, okay, Jenny's not doing anyone any favor. She doesn't mean to be, but like, you know, but eventually Jenny's going to get to the point where she's on the other side of it, where she's like, I can't get this immediately. Like, but I've made it this far. Like, something must be really broken. It's like, no, like there's so much about that. There's a particular sore spot that you're really kind of sticking your finger into on me here, in a good way, actually, because for years I've had a lot of trouble talking about this, not just with prospective clients, but with people I've worked with for a while. Like, if I work with people for a long while, they get it, but in the early stages, like, you look at my resume, right? I'm, you know, MIT trained 3-time puzzle champion, math competition coach and winner, and, you know, all this stuff. Like, I'm the linear thinkers, like, I'm a nerd's nerd, right? Like, I'm all about this super, you know, brainy stuff. And I don't mean to say that in the sense of I'm smart. I mean, like, the nature of my training, right, is all aimed at this super abstract nerdery. And so so everyone always expects, or many people expect, right, that I'm going to jump into calculus tutoring and I'm going to be about all the esoterica of calculus. And it's like, okay, well, if that's what the student needs, I'm happy to nerd out. Like, sure, I'll go there. But so often people just, like, I go into this math session for this kid who's taking some advanced math class or whatever it is, and we spend 2/3 of the time talking about the way the kid feels about the math. And the parents are like, one, what am I paying you for? Two, who are you? What good is this, right? And then they have a talk with their kid about what he experienced during the session, and then they come back. But there's this real disconnect, right? Because it's like, you're supposed to be this math guy. Why are you talking about all this other nutty, crunchy stuff? And it's like, talk to Ian. That's why I'm doing it. Because, like, if you're not set up to bring your A game, then no amount of A game from me is going to help you. Like, my goal isn't to look smarter than you. Yeah. My goal is to empower you to be as smart as you can be. And I mean, that brings us back to the beginning of our discussion and this part of our relationship, Ian, is that idea of there's a big difference between someone bringing their A+ game and someone bringing their D- game. You know, no matter how good their A+ game is or whatever, like, you know, I'll take an untalented person on a great day over a genius on a horrible day any day.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that part of it, and we've talked about this before, is this kind of level of self-awareness around that for the student, and then for the parents to start to think that way about, you know, the biggest variable for the person is the person, you know, in their conscious experience of the world around them. And
okay, you might need to unpack that a little for me, but go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So I mean, just maybe like to start with, like, what mood, like, how's your mood, right? It starts to create narratives. If you're in a negative mood, then you start to create narratives about your conscious experience of the world that may or may not be true, but they're definitely colored in some way, that in a more subjective way, because that's how you're feeling. And,
and in fact, last episode I talked about a way in which one of those kind of got
exactly right,
you know, locked in for me in a really negative way. Yeah.
Wrong, you know, perspective about an employee that continues to fill out a worse and worse version of something that's not exactly true at all. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a big piece. Also, what do you perceive, like, which is based on the frameworks, like, or your umwelt that you're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
Right. That's a big variable. Your memory. What do you huge variable, all these things, but we don't really think about them as much as the kind of outside world as the bigger variables. And so I think, like, what you're talking about is, like, really diving in with a student about you're, like, saying, hey, I know what the biggest variable is. And you're saying, like, that's what I'm going to focus on first, even when I'm I'm cocky enough to do this, because I know I'm so confident about it, because this is not in line with the parents' perspectives who are paying the bills. You know, like it's at that level is what you're doing. And I think, like, and to me, I think that's really important, and something that really hard for people to keep in mind. I think even in education, and because I think school, as we were talking about before, continues to, like, okay, we just need to change the standards, change something about what we're doing, you know, or something, because that's what we can, again, it's what they can change the most, probably, because there's a lot of stuff, you know, with children going on at home or whatever, but it's not actually effective because they're not pushing the buttons that are affecting the variable that counts the most, which is the student. And again, I'm thinking that it's pretty much impossible because schools' indoor air quality is very bad, which we know affects brain. So there's that extra piece to it, but just at a fundamental level, even without throwing in my favorite word, mold, I think that it still kind of holds weight. I'm gonna. Yeah, please. Sorry. Yeah, go. Yeah, stop me there.
No, I only want to pause you for a sec, and that's to bring up, since you're bringing up the mold thing. I'm going to bring up another way in which this plays out, which is the fundamental attribution error, right? The idea that, like, if I do something wrong, it's because I'm having a bad day, but if you do something wrong, it's because you're a bad person.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that I never really thought about this before, but you've pointed out that built-in human bias affects the stuff we're talking about too. You know, it's like, from the teacher's point of view, I can see that the student is the big variable. But when I'm the student, I'm looking around at the classroom and the textbooks and the teachers and trying to figure out what about them is causing me to have a good or bad experience. It's like, yeah, fundamental attribution error. I'm forgetting that I am the one who is, you know, doing it right or doing it wrong in that moment for a variety of reasons.
Right, and so both ways, and as the teacher, that they have more control than they think, you know, in terms of how are they learning as an individual and the potential impact that might have on the children around them. I definitely think that's it. And kind of taking it back to, I think we talked about these, like, the most transformative critical learning periods we were talking about with psychedelics. We'll keep those out of school, but the idea...
Yeah, probably a good idea.
We're still keeping those separate, but the idea, you know, of what happens during those critical learning periods, you know, drug-induced or just part of who, you know, our biological periods as humans...
Sure.
Is that there's this shaking up of the self's relationship to the environment, where there's far more awareness of the individual's engagement, not just the external environment, but they're in the way that they're interacting, that the learning happens so much faster. And I think that tutoring and Wes in a, you know, soundproof room banging on the piano seems to get closer to that, because there's this vacuum, because that's something else that is talked about as a way to get into critical learning periods, is to have is to completely divorce yourself from your usual reality. So for example, if you're learning a new language, you know, for example, you immerse yourself and you make sure there's no English around, right? So if you're going to learn Spanish, you go to Guatemala, you don't go to so much more self-aware because of the absence of your umwelt.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right. Not only that, but in Guatemala, the restaurants aren't the ones you're used to. The sidewalks are maybe a different color. The temperature is different. Like, all the things that, like, you've brains are lazy. Like, and I don't mean that as a pejorative, right? That's their function, right? Is to be as efficient as possible with the energy that they have. So we structure our days and our routines in conjunction with our environment, right? To be as easy as possible for whatever that means for us. Like, I don't need to think very hard about where I can get a good cup of coffee in my neighborhood. Like, I've got it dialed in. But if I were in Guatemala, like, it would be like this project, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure I could find a cup of coffee, whatever, but like, there's a lot more effort involved. And because there's more effort, right, I'm engaging these parts of, sorry, I'm back with you. If I'm in Guatemala, right, then rather than getting to be on autopilot, I've really got to think about everything. And that's the thing, is when you're on autopilot, you're running the program that got written earlier, maybe decades earlier. Like, you didn't know as much then. Whereas if you're in the moment, you're using all the skills you have today. And it's like, oh, this is a whole new world. Well, yeah, it is a whole new world, because guess what? You're a whole new you. You're now being you instead of the you used to be, right? It's like coaches say, don't let a 14-year-old run your life. In other words, don't hang on to the plans you had when you were a kid if they no longer serve you. And yet, on some subconscious level, that's a piece of what goes on in our heads. Anyway, again, I'm kind of, off the beaten path here, but
no, I'm right there with you. I'm like, and so I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking parallel. I'm like thinking, you know what? A good gauge for someone's brain health is how much do they like traveling? Because if everything you're describing is fun, right, then it seems that people's neuroinflammation is not so high that all that new stuff is overwhelming. Because imagine, especially like someone who's elderly,
Okay.
right? And it's just, they're a little bit kind of more in a kind of heightened state of pain. Usually, you're just in pain at some level when you're old. So then your brain is kind of at this like kind of feeling, even if it's low grade. So can't find the cup of coffee in the place I need it to be. Good God, this place, I'm stressed, kind of thing. And I say that from very personal experience, because when I was in this, haunted house level of mold where my brain was on fire, my routine was so regimented just to get through the day in terms of how I was feeling. But also I noticed when I moved, it took forever for me to remember, okay, where do I put everything? Where, my keys went there, my wallet's there. What's, okay, kitchen, this is where I take the trash, just like simple stuff, all these simple behaviors that dominate your day just around, the, work and everything else become like taxing. And in a different situation, I'm like, oh, this is kind of fun, when my brain's in a healthy spot where I'm like, no, this is new and I'm getting used to this cool, like, kind of new setup here, versus I'm like, oh my God, just like, how am I going to do this? And it's all about, to me, a neurological basis where it's like, where is your cytokine level at base? Yeah. Is it kind of higher and this is going to feel overwhelming, or are you kind of at a normal low level? So this is going to be kind of fun, new stuff, all of that. And I would urge people to consider the idea, like, let's talk about political parties, that there's an element in both Democrats, the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, where they're pretty reactive and not liking change, really, actually, which is interesting for the progressive side, or like just not liking things that are outside of their very specific worldview, and being very quick to be like, that's bad. And really feel like, this is a personal affront, just in the same way where you're like, where is my cup of coffee in the morning? You need things to work out this way because too stressful. You just can't handle it,
Yeah, there's a big difference between,
I don't know.
There's a big difference between I respectfully disagree with my esteemed opponent and my enemy is evil. And that you're talking about that spectrum there, right?
My enemy is influenced by, I guess like Jewish. What was it like? Some crazy stuff on the Republican Party.
Because it's just, some of it is just nuts. But
we're not going to say the specifics because it's not worth airing.
But it's a good point, right? You're talking about, okay, I'm gonna do this in a way that hits people on an emotional level, precisely because I want to bypass their higher reasoning, because I know that's how we're going to get more of what seems to be good for us in the short term. Right. And I mean, it's a prisoner's dilemma setup, right? It's like, if what's good for me in the short term and what's good for me in the long term are substantially different, and you're in an oppositional situation, then you have a problem. It's not going to end well. It's just, yeah. And I think that's a piece of what I was kind of thinking when I was talking about the time horizon thing. Right? If you're thinking about how you're going to win re-election in 18 months, instead of thinking about how we're going to be in a better place in the next generation, I mean, obviously you're, as a politician, you're thinking both these thoughts, but like, Pareto, like 80% of your attention is going to be on one or the other of them. And there's a big difference between 80-20 versus 20-80 in that context.
So here's a flip example, like a foil, let's say. Michael Jordan. I know this is seems a little bit off, but I think it comes back to music also. The way that he worked with his teammates was pretty kind of like elbow in their side, combative, talking trash, in a way kind of putting in question, like kind of like shaking up the social fabric, where everyone felt like, oh, I'm okay here, I'm like fine how I am, right? So kind of, and I do this with tutoring too, like shake up, who do you think you are? Right? I'm like, I think it's somebody else. Usually describing students in terms of way higher potential than they realize, because I firmly believe that, and I see it all the time, and a lot of bullshit learning behaviors that's standing in their way. So I'm like, it's kind of a bullying.
Can I just throw in an amen, brother, just off on the sidelines? Please continue.
So I'm just gonna say that again, just because I said that kind of fast. Brilliant people with bullshit learning behavior standing in their way. I mean, I see it everywhere. And again,
for sure,
people will see me and be like, Ian's so smart or whatever. I'm like, bullshit. Like, I've just gotten over more learning behaviors that have been challenged, causing my issues than you have. Maybe, and sure, there's the epigenetic stuff that people get from their parents, but what really counts is behavior, and so anyways, so I'm reframing them, shaking them up, just like MJ did with his teammates. He did a little bit like, I think someone punched someone in the face, and there's a little bit more violent stuff, but
spiky about it, like in a way that caused trouble.
Spiky, and but if you watch this amazing documentary about the Bulls called The Last Dance, and it goes through like leading up to the '97 season, and where everything was magical, kind of like the perfect kind of jazz ensemble kind of feeling of a team. And it's in the way that, long-term thinking, hey, people might not like me in the moment, whatever. I'm focused on making these people, challenging them to be who they could actually be, beyond the kind of bullshit stuff that they've gotten lost in, because they've probably been kind of innately talented to a point, gotten pretty far, but not really been shaken up since then, or to the degree that Michael Jordan saw in them. And I think he's the ultimate kind of coach player in that sense, which I try to be as a tutor, as like a friend to my students, being like, no more bullshit, buddy. Like, I see something in you, you don't. And this might get a little bit rough and tumble if you don't start acting like yourself. Let's play one-on-one, because this is going to go, and we'll see what we can do. And I think that, the magic of the team kind of like at a level that's kind of similar to Wes Carroll, kind of like playing the piano by himself, like really, like at a level where it's like, hey, I can be a better team member now. I can play in a band. I can contribute on a team level because I've dug into the mastery level of stuff, and which has included being aware of myself in that process, and like and starting to find my blind spots and address them in that process. And and I think that helps, that when you have a good tutor, a good instructor, a good teammate coach kind of person in your life, it just can happen a lot faster, which I think is the other piece of what you're saying with like what we started off with, which is the ideal thing is just help people see what they're missing along the way, right? But it might also be like them, them, right? Like, it's not just the content thing. It's like, hey, do you see how you're acting like a piece of crap here? Like, kind of thing, like being overconfident and just more worried about how people are judging you. And again, I'm like, by the way, we know it's not your fault because this world created you, school and everything else.
But here's an example of a choice you've made in response to that's not serving you well. And it's tricky too, because you and I both know what a fine line it is between being the right kind of challenge that helps someone rise to their potential and just being a hurtful jerk. You know what I mean? Like, you're really playing with fire there, but it's the only way you're going to cook the meal. it's what you gotta get close.
Well, exactly. And and the thing is, I think MJ probably crossed the line a little bit because he was like, I need to win, right? So there was this kind of selfish thing that played into it, so where it came. And I know tutors can be this way where, maybe they're facing the pressure of parents, kind of like, we need this goal, the score increase and all that. So then they're like, but more likely it's something going on in the tutor's personal life. I think that's giving them, they're starting off with a negative kind of attitude going into a tutoring session, and then they're quick to snap, making it about them rather than the student. And I would say That's happened to me about 3 or 4 times. Very embarrassed to say, where I was, but every time else, every other time outside of that, I'm thinking, I'm yelling a little bit, but I have a huge smile on my face, and the kid is hearing me, and a lot of times, this kind of saying, like, it's basically saying, I love you, because I'm saying, like, look, I know all the good shit about you. I know all the bad shit about you. And very few people are in children's lives these days are anywhere close to comfortable or in a position to share that information in a way that it can be received in a way that shows real affirmation. One where it's like, hey, you're good as you are, not let me just focus on the things that I think are good about you that intersect with my value system. Ignore things that and not talk about things that aren't, because I don't even want to look at that as a parent / teacher, right? And then the kid, again, back to my discussion of insecurity and anxiety, is in a position where they feel motivated to hide things they don't know, and might even go further to adopt a blasé attitude where filtering more information is cooler, and it's just, the forces are really challenging, and for a child these days. And like I said, it's the Hercules story. It's like, you can still become a god among mortals, immortal in terms of like your engagement with the world, what you can get out of life. But it's tough. There's a lot of kind of mere mortal forces bringing you back to earth that are just kind of making you feel not good enough, not a god, just mortal, and I think the more people can appreciate the level of challenge that kids are going through and the Herculean effort that they're really undergoing, I think the more that they can really climb this hill, because at least they're appreciating what's actually happening, and what they have to be aware of and adjust them, be well adjusted to kind of deal with, so that they're actually pressing the right buttons, to deal with those things. Because otherwise you get lost in this kind of self-judgment cycle that doesn't really get anywhere. It really actually hurts, like we've been saying.
Yeah. If something's going on that prevents you from being the place you're trying to be, your power to deal with that is more limited than you may otherwise think.
Yeah, and I think that's why I keep coming back to this idea of learning to learn again, is this idea of coming home, right? Where you're not in this kind of other stress state, you're in this kind of relaxed state in which you can be self-aware.
Yeah.
Right? So that your awareness, and it starts there, self-aware, in order to be aware of other people's perspectives also. But if you're not self-aware, then there's no freaking way you're going to have an accurate read at all on other people's perspectives, because you're not even aware of how your emotional state, whether you're hungry or not, do you need to pee right now, all that kind of stuff is completely conditioning your conscious
and
experience.
You're completely getting into the purpose of a coach in some contexts. I'm thinking, so one of the things about music, if you want to become a better musician, okay, one of the first things they'll tell you is that you should listen to yourself as you play, which is easier said than done. But what they don't say is that if you're listening to yourself while you're playing, you're not using 100% of your brain on either. Now, yes, you have to learn to listen and play at the same time. That's an advanced skill, more advanced than we give it credit for. If you really want to listen to yourself play, the way to do it is press record and then put 100% of your effort on playing, and then listen back and discover that you sound nothing like what you thought you sounded like. That's the feedback loop, right? Is you get that sense of, oh, now I'm listening to what's going on. If I'm in the middle of learning something difficult, like, I can't be paying attention to all this other stuff. You're in the room. You can tell me, hey, Wes, you're looking kind of stressed, and I'm focused on the thing. I'm like, that's funny, Ian. I don't feel stressed. I feel like I'm concentrating very hard. And it's like, dude, you're vibrating. Like, calm down. Like, whatever it is. It can be hugely helpful to get that, that person whose job it is to monitor your state, so that you can try to focus on this thing you're trying to learn. But you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, like we were talking about, at the top of the discussion, you do have to learn to do that yourself. but there's always going to be some extra benefit that you can get from getting some extra help, not just because they know the material better, but because they're also aware that you need to be in a certain space in order to learn, and they can monitor you.
And I think I was thinking about it. Very successful writers do a good job of this also, which is this zoom in, zoom out in terms of perspective to give you new context that's valuable that you wouldn't be thinking in that very specific space that you're in. So it's like that's kind of seems to be what a tutor can really do a great job at, is asking the right questions to really pull forth like a new context that a student and, you know, anybody can really kind of like, oh, you know, now I'm here, I have this new framework. And again, they're coming to it of their own accord, but it's just that question, that scratching at the edge of the cave that I think that, I think can be really valuable. And I guess for Michael Jordan, it involves like, you know, a little bit of like, you know, nudging in during one-on-one and getting a little physical, but I think there's a little bit of like conflict, I think, that needs to happen to shake people up a little bit, you know, so, or at least a conflict in, there will be this friction between the person's self-perception and the guide's perception of that person that kind of gets reconciled in the process of learning any material at the tutoring at its best, because it's the changing of two variables, the skill sets, maybe the three concept skill sets, and the person themselves in the most successful kind of learning relationship. And I think that's kind of what I've been trying to accomplish and what I call savant tutoring in my book, because it's like really starting with, hey, the person, and that's the number one variable, like you said. That's where we're starting, and trusting that if you really focus on that, even though it's not as like, oh yeah, final, you know, unit test in 1 week, right? It's more like, hey, you're going to change to a point where this is going to be a lot easier for you, honestly, and you won't really need me. Is the kind of philosophy that I'm all about, because it's really about, you know, self-elimination as a tutor, not what you're saying about, you know, basically the teacher kind of doing the thinking for the student, and they're like, I'm going to follow these directions and I hope everything's okay, you know, at the end of the day.
To me, you're talking about transformation. Like what I'm realizing now that what you are saying, and I agree with you, or correct me if I'm misinterpreting, is that transformation is not intrinsically safe, and transformation is not systematizable in that way. Like, yeah, you can be good at, you know, helping people achieve a transformation, but you can't bottle it. And transformation involves identity threat, among other things. That's the whole point, is you're becoming a different person. And that doesn't feel good in the moment. Might feel great afterwards, but it's one of the most stressful experiences on all the surveys or whatever, right? It's like getting fired, moving, you know, all that kind of stuff.